In a forgotten southwest town, a young war widow was about to uncover the most dangerous secret in frontier history. What started as a 40-cent auction bid took a shocking turn when she came face to face with symbols carved by criminals into courthouse stone. Margaret, Maggie Calloway, wasn't your typical property buyer. For 3 years since losing her husband in World War II, she had spent her life buried in historical archives, known for her meticulous research and quiet determination to preserve uncomfortable truths. When she encountered the abandoned courthouse and its mysterious encoded markings, she had no idea she was walking into a web of corruption that had claimed lives for decades. Maggie followed the symbols deeper into hidden vaults that would lead to exposing $14 million in stolen assets and a ledger documenting systematic bribery of judges, sheriffs, and town founders. What began as academic research would become a fight for survival against powerful families determined to keep the past buried. The entire Southwest would never be the same after she chose truth over silence, even as fire consumed the courthouse and threatened to destroy the only evidence that could prove a century of lies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The auctioneer's voice carried across the dusty town square, tired and mechanical. He'd been at it for 3 hours, selling off parcels of farmland and rusted equipment to men who wore their Sunday best, despite the sweltering heat. Margaret Calloway stood at the back of the crowd, a notebook pressed against her chest, watching the proceedings with the careful attention of someone who studied everything. Most of the buyers had come for the ranch property, the Henderson place, with its 100 acres of scrubland and a main house that still had good bones. That went for $800 to a man with oil-stained hands and ambitious eyes. Then came the smaller lots: tools, furniture, a wagon with 3 working wheels. When the auctioneer's assistant brought out the listing for the old courthouse, the murmuring stopped entirely. "Next item," the auctioneer said, clearing his throat. "The former county courthouse on Mesa Street. Built 1891, structure as is, no guarantees on condition. Nobody moved." The building had sat empty since before most of them were born, its windows boarded over, its front steps crumbling into the earth. People said it brought bad luck, that men who'd worked there had died badly, or disappeared, or gone mad from whatever darkness soaked into those stones. Maggie had heard all the stories. She'd also seen the architectural drawings in the county records, the careful craftsmanship that went into buildings from that era. Frontier justice might have been rough, but the structures that housed it were built to last. "Do I hear a starting bid?" The auctioneer looked out across the crowd with dim hope. 25 cents. Silence. A few men shifted their weight and studied their boots. Maggie raised her hand. 40 cents. Every head turned. The women in their cotton dresses, the men with their weather-beaten faces, all of them staring at the young widow in her simple grey suit, the one who'd moved to town 6 months ago and kept him mostly to herself. The auctioneer blinked. 40 cents. "Do I hear 50? More silence. Then someone in the crowd laughed, short and uncomfortable. "Sold," the auctioneer said quickly, before anyone could change their minds. "To the lady in grey, 40 cents for the courthouse." Sheriff Harlan Reeves approached as the crowd dispersed, his badge catching the afternoon sun. He was older than Maggie by perhaps 15 years, with the kind of weathered face that came from long days under the desert sky and longer nights wondering if he'd done the right thing. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, "that's quite a perch sheet." "It's for my research," Maggie replied, tucking her notebook under her arm. "I'm writing my thesis on frontier justice systems. The building will be an excellent primary source." "That building's been empty a long time." Reeves's voice carried a warning wrapped in politeness. "Lot of folks think it's best to leave the past buried." Maggie met his gaze steadily. "History doesn't scare easy, Sheriff." Something flickered in his eyes. "Respect, maybe, or concern. Just be careful in there. Structure's not sound." Floorboards are rotted through in places. I'll watch my step." He nodded slowly, but didn't move away. "My grandfather was sheriff when that courthouse was still operating. He used to say it held more secrets than prisoners." He paused. He wasn't wrong. Before Maggie could ask what he meant, Reeves touched his hat brim again and walked away, boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The key they gave her was iron, heavy in her palm, its teeth worn smooth by decades of use. Maggie stood alone in front of the courthouse as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The building looked worse up close. Its roof sagged in the middle like a broken spine. The windows were clouded with grime where they weren't boarded completely. Wooden beams showed signs of dry rot, and the stone walls bore stains from years of wind-driven rain and neglect. Most people would have seen only ruin. Maggie saw possibility. She fitted the key into the lock. It stuck at first, rust fighting against motion, but with steady pressure it turned. The door swung inward with a groan that seemed to echo from somewhere deep inside the building. The smell hit her immediately. Dust and decay, yes, but something else underneath. The scent of old paper and sun-baked wood and time itself, layered thick as paint. The afternoon light slanted through gaps in the boarded windows, creating bars of gold across the wooden floor. The main hall stretched before her, surprisingly intact despite the neglect. The floor was solid beneath her feet, though covered in years of accumulated dirt. Her left, a staircase led to the second floor, where the judge's chambers would have been. To her right, the doorway to what had once been the courtroom. Maggie moved toward the courtroom, her footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence. The judge's bench still stood at the far end of the room, a massive piece of carved oak that had survived when everything else had crumbled. The witness stand remained to its right, and the jury box to its left, though most of the benches for spectators had been removed or had collapsed entirely. She approached the judge's bench slowly, running her fingers along its surface. Someone had taken great care with this piece. The wood was smooth despite the years, and the carving along the front showed skill and patience. That's when she noticed the mark. At first they looked like random scratches, water damage maybe, or just the wear of time. But as Maggie knelt to examine them more closely, she realized they formed patterns, deliberate marks carved into the stone wall behind the bench. A circle with 3 radiating lines, a diamond with a dot at its center, a triangle bisected by a single vertical line. They repeated in sequence along the wall, each symbol carved with the same depth and precision. Someone had spent considerable time creating these marks. They weren't graffiti or casual vandalism, they meant something. Maggie traced one symbol with her fingertip. The stone felt cool despite the heat outside, and the groove of the carving was surprisingly deep. Fresh, almost as if protected from the elements by the building's thick walls. The sun was setting now, its light turning the dust motes into floating embers. Shadows stretched across the courtroom floor, and in that shifting light, Maggie saw more symbols. They continued along the baseboard, barely visible unless you were looking for them. Each mark placed with purpose, forming a sequence that led toward the back of the room. A message waiting to be understood. Maggie pulled out her notebook and began to sketch what she saw. The academic in her taking over despite the growing darkness and the way her heartbeat had quickened. She'd come here looking for history. She'd found something else entirely. As she worked, transcribing each symbol with careful precision, she couldn't shake Sheriff Reeves' words. The courthouse held more secrets than prisoners. Looking at these deliberate, encoded marks, carved into permanent stone, Maggie was beginning to believe he'd understated the matter entirely. The last rays of sunlight died against the western wall, and Maggie realized she'd been working by the light of dusk without noticing. She gathered her things, cast one more look at the symbols on the wall, and made her way back through the darkening hall to the entrance. Tomorrow she would return with proper lighting and more supplies. Tonight, she had research to do. These symbols had to mean something. Someone had gone to great effort to leave them behind. As she locked the door and started back toward town, Maggie felt the weight of those carved marks following her, not threateningly, but insistently, like a voice from the past that had been waiting decades for someone to listen. Maggie returned to the courthouse at dawn, carrying a canvas bag filled with paper, pencils, a camera she'd borrowed from the town's newspaper editor, and 2 kerosene lanterns. The morning air was still cool, and the light had that clear quality that made everything seem sharper, more real. She'd spent half the night researching symbols in her collection of historical texts. Frontier markings, surveyors' codes, even old mining signs. Nothing matched exactly what she'd found carved into the courthouse walls, but the systematic nature of the marks suggested they formed a language of sorts. A code meant to convey information to someone who knew how to read it. The key turned more easily this time. Inside, the courthouse felt different in the morning light. Less ominous, more melancholy. A building forgotten by time, waiting patiently for someone to remember its purpose. Maggie lit both lanterns and began her work methodically. She photographed each symbol she'd found the previous evening, then started searching for others. Her instinct told her the marks in the courtroom were only part of a larger sequence. She was right. In the hallway outside the courtroom, she found more carvings near the floor. The same symbols, but arranged in different patterns. A circle-diamond-triangle sequence, then a triangle-circle-diamond. The variations suggested meaning beyond mere decoration. The staircase to the second floor creaked under her weight, but held firm. Upstairs she found the judge's chambers and 2 smaller offices that might have belonged to clerks or attorneys. The rooms were empty except for dust and a few pieces of broken furniture, but the symbols continued here too, carved into door frames, etched into the stone sills of windows, each mark placed with intention, forming a trail that wound through the entire building. Maggie spent hours documenting everything, her notebook filling with sketches and measurements. She noticed that certain symbols appeared more frequently than others. The triangle bisected by a line showed up at regular intervals, always near doorways or transitions between rooms. It was in the 3rd office, the smallest room at the back of the building, that she found the anomaly. One particular symbol, the triangle with the line, had been carved deeper than all the others. The groove in the stone was nearly half an inch deep, and when Maggie ran her fingers along it, she felt the edges were sharper, less worn by time. The symbol was carved into a stone that formed part of the wall itself. But unlike the surrounding stones, this one shifted slightly when she pressed against it. Maggie set down her lantern and examined the stone more carefully. The mortar around its edges looked different, newer, or at least less degraded than the rest. She worked her fingernails into the gap between the stone and its neighbors, feeling for purchase. With steady pressure, the stone moved inward. Behind it lay a small cavity, deliberately carved into the wall itself, and inside that cavity, protected from light and air for who knew how many years, was a piece of parchment folded into a tight square. Maggie's hands trembled as she extracted the parchment. It was yellowed with age, but remarkably well preserved. She carried it carefully to the window where the morning light was strongest, and unfolded it with the delicacy she'd learned, handling old documents. The parchment contained a drawing, a crude but accurate floor plan of the courthouse, complete with the courtroom, the cells, the offices upstairs. But this version of the building showed something extra. Additional rooms marked in the basement level, rooms Maggie hadn't known existed, and throughout the drawing, the same symbols from the walls were scattered in specific locations, each one numbered in a sequence that suggested a path. A route through the building leading to Maggie squinted at the bottom corner of the parchment. There, in faded ink barely visible against the aged paper, were 2 initials written in an ornate hand. She stared at those letters, committing them to memory, then carefully refolded the parchment and placed it in her notebook. The courthouse didn't just hold architectural history, it held secrets, deliberately encoded and preserved by someone who'd signed their work. Maggie descended the stairs and returned to the courtroom, studying it with fresh eyes. If the parchment was accurate, there should be a way to access the basement level. The symbols formed a path. She just needed to learn how to follow it. She spent the rest of the morning photographing every symbol she could find, creating a complete catalogue. By noon, she had dozens of images and pages of notes. More than enough to begin serious analysis. But something nagged at her. The initials. They felt familiar somehow, like a name she'd heard in passing but couldn't quite place. That evening, back in the small room she rented above the general store, Maggie composed a letter to her mentor, Evelyn Moore. Evelyn was a retired journalist who'd covered organized crime in the 1920s and 30s, before a story got too close to powerful people and ended her career. She'd moved to Santa Fe afterward, where she continued to follow criminal history as a scholar, rather than a reporter. If anyone could identify the initials CS in the context of a 1890s courthouse on the southwest frontier, it would be Evelyn. Maggie included several photographs with her letter, showing both the symbols and the parchment's floor plan. She wrote carefully, trying to convey the systematic nature of the markings without sounding overly dramatic. Dear Evelyn, I've made an unusual discovery that requires your expertise. The courthouse I recently acquired contains what appears to be a coded system of symbols throughout its structure. These marks seem to indicate hidden spaces within the building, possibly dating to the 1890s or early 90s. Most intriguing is a parchment I found concealed in the wall, bearing the initials CS. The deliberate nature of these markings suggests someone wanted to preserve information that needed to remain hidden from casual observers. Your knowledge of historical criminal networks may prove invaluable. Have you encountered similar encoded architectural markings in your research? And do the initials CS mean anything in the context of southwestern crime during that era? Enclosed are photographs of the symbols and the parchment. I would welcome any insights you might have. With gratitude, Margaret. She sealed the letter and walked it to the post office before she could second-guess herself. Evelyn would either think she was chasing shadows or she'd recognize something significant. Either way, Maggie would have her answer within a week. But as she walked back to her room in the fading light, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd set something in motion. The symbols weren't just historical curiosities. They were directions, a map leading to something someone had wanted, both hidden and findable, if you knew where to look. And now Maggie was looking. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the floor plan on the parchment, the rooms marked in the basement that supposedly didn't exist. Tomorrow she would search for the entrance. The symbols would show her the way. They had to. She fell asleep with her notebook open beside her, filled with sketches of circles and triangles and diamonds, each one a word in a language she was only beginning to comprehend. Outside, the desert wind whispered against the window, carrying the scent of sage and dust and secrets that had waited decades to be uncovered. 3 days passed before Maggie returned to the courthouse at night. She'd spent the intervening time gathering supplies and building her courage. The evening visits felt necessary now. The building revealed different aspects of itself in darkness, and she needed to understand it completely before she tried to find the hidden basement rooms. She arrived after sunset, carrying both lanterns and a small toolkit. The key had become familiar in her hand, its weight and shape as known to her now as her own possessions. The door opened smoothly, almost welcoming. Inside, the lantern light created dancing shadows that made the symbols on the walls seem to move. Maggie forced herself to breathe steadily, to think like the researcher she was rather than the woman alone in a building that might not be as empty as it should be. She'd developed a theory about the symbols. The deepest carvings, like the one that had hidden the parchment, marked significant locations, places where something important had been concealed. If she could find similar deep carvings, she might discover more hidden compartments, more pieces of whatever puzzle someone had left behind. Maggie started in the courthouse cells, the small rooms where prisoners had once been kept. There were 6 cells in total, 3 on each side of a narrow corridor. Their iron doors hung open, rust having long since frozen their hinges in place. The first cell yielded nothing unusual. The second showed signs of old fire damage, the stone walls blackened but intact. The third, Maggie stopped in the doorway, lantern raised, footprints in the dust, fresh footprints that led from the cell door to the far wall and back again. Her pulse quickened. She'd been the only person in this building for days. She was certain of it. And yet these tracks looked recent, the dust disturbed in clean lines that hadn't had time to settle back into smoothness. Someone else had been here. She forced herself to think logically. Perhaps Sheriff Reeves had checked on the property. Perhaps some curious townsperson had explored during the day while she was away. The courthouse was hers by law, but that didn't mean others wouldn't poke around an unlocked building. Except Maggie knew she'd locked the door when she left 3 days ago. The key had been in her possession the entire time. She followed the footprints to the back wall of the cell, where they stopped abruptly at a section of stone that looked no different from any other. But when she raised the lantern higher, she saw it. The triangle symbol, carved deep and sharp into the mortar between 2 stones, and below it at floor level, scratch marks, recent ones. Someone had been trying to pry the stones. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maggie knelt, setting the lantern beside her. She ran her fingers along the mortar line, feeling for weakness. Surge shifted under her touch, just slightly, not loose enough to remove by hand, but definitely movable with the right tools. A sound echoed through the corridor behind her. Footsteps, real ones this time, not prints in dust, but actual boot heels striking stone. Maggie grabbed her lantern and stood quickly, her heart hammering. "Hello? Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. "This is private property," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "You're trespassing." Silence. Then more footsteps, moving away from her now, heading toward the front of the building. Maggie followed, moving as quickly as she dared in the uncertain light. The corridor opened into the main hall, empty, but the front door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see darkness and hear nothing. Whoever had been here was gone. Or hiding. She checked the door's lock, undamaged. No sign of forced entry, which meant either she'd forgotten to lock it properly, unlikely, or someone else had a key. Maggie closed the door firmly and turned back to the interior, raising her lantern high. The building felt different now, less forgotten, more watched, as if the walls themselves were paying attention to her movements. She should leave, come back tomorrow in daylight with Sheriff Reeves. That would be the sensible thing to do. Instead, she walked toward the back of the building, past the cells to the door she'd noticed on her first visit, but hadn't yet examined. A heavy oak door with iron hinges and a lock that had rusted shut decades ago. The records room. Maggie studied the lock by lantern light. The mechanism was seized completely, but the wood around the hinges had weakened. With the right pressure in the right place, the door might give way entirely. She retrieved a crowbar from her toolkit and wedged it between the door and the frame, near the top hinge. The wood groaned but held. She tried again, applying steady force. With a sharp crack, the top hinge pulled free from the rotted frame. Maggie repositioned the crowbar and worked on the bottom hinge. This one gave way more easily, and the door tilted inward, hanging now by the lock alone. One more application of leverage, and the entire door fell inward with a sound like breaking bones. Dust billowed out in thick clouds, making her cough. She waved the lantern to clear the air, then stepped cautiously into the records room. Papers everywhere, scattered across the floor, piled on broken shelves, some still organized in wooden file boxes that had somehow survived the years. Maggie's historian's heart ached at the disorder, at the careless destruction of documents that should have been preserved. But as she moved deeper into the room, she realized the disorder was recent. The papers had been deliberately scattered, Someone had searched this room, and not carefully. She knelt beside the nearest pile of documents, setting her lantern down. Most were routine courthouse records, deeds, marriage licenses, court proceedings from cases long forgotten. Then she found the file. It was thicker than the others, bound in leather that had cracked with age, but still bore an official seal, and stamped across the front in faded gold letters, Corwin Syndicate Investigation. Maggie opened the file with shaking hands. Inside were police reports, witness statements, and a detailed inventory of confiscated assets from what the documents described as an extensive criminal enterprise involving bootlegging, smuggling, and systematic bribery of public officials. The list of confiscated assets ran for 3 pages. Cash, jewelry, automobiles, real estate. Total value estimated at $14 million in 1932 currency. But at the bottom of the inventory, a single line written in red ink. Assets never recovered. Whereabouts unknown. $14 million. Hidden somewhere. It's found. And someone had left clues carved into the walls of this courthouse, marking a path that led where? To the missing fortune. Maggie sat back on her heels, the file clutched in her hands. The symbols weren't just historical markings, they were a treasure map. Created by members of the Corwin Syndicate, hidden in plain sight within the very building where they'd been prosecuted. The initials on the parchment, CS, not the mark of an individual, the Corwin Syndicate itself. Jesus, she whispered. Find something interesting. Maggie spun around, nearly dropping the file. Sheriff Harlan Reeves stood in the doorway, his own lantern casting his face in harsh shadows. His hand rested on the gun at his hip, though he wasn't drawing it. Sheriff, Maggie stood slowly, clutching the file to her chest. You startled me. Noticed a light in here from the street. Wanted to make sure it was you and not thieves. His eyes moved to the scattered papers, then back to her face. Lot of folks still search old buildings for hidden loot. Heard you might have found something that attract that sort of attention. How would anyone hear that? I've told no one. Reeves stepped into the room, his boots crunching on loose paper. Small town, Miss Calloway. People notice things, and this courthouse has a reputation. Always has. What kind of reputation? The kind that gets people killed. He gestured at the file in her hands. Like whatever you're holding right now. That wouldn't happen to be related to the Corwin investigation, would it? Maggie hesitated. Trust was earned, not given freely. It's public record, isn't it? Part of the courthouse archives, public record, that's been sitting undisturbed for 40 years. Reeves moved closer, until someone bought the building and started poking around where maybe they shouldn't. Are you warning me, Sheriff, or threatening me? Something flickered in his expression. Warning. This building has cost men their lives, Miss Calloway. My own father among them. If there's something hidden here, something valuable, then you're not the only one looking for it. And the others won't be as polite as me. He glanced at the scattered papers again, then back to her. Lock this place up tight when you leave. Bar the doors if you have to. And maybe consider that history isn't always meant to be dug up. I thought you said your grandfather believed the courthouse held secrets. He did, and he died wondering what they were. Reeves tipped his hat. Learn from other people's mistakes, Miss Calloway. That's what history's really for. He left as quietly as he'd arrived, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Maggie stood alone in the records room, surrounded by scattered documents and the weight of too many questions. She looked down at the Corwin file. $14 million, hidden somewhere in or near this building. Symbols carved into the walls as directions, and people, dangerous people, who knew she was close to finding it. Maggie tucked the file carefully into her bag, along with several related documents. Tomorrow she would photograph everything, create copies, establish a paper trail that would protect her if something happened. Tonight she needed to get out of this building. She gathered her lanterns and tools, then made her way toward the front door. As she reached for the handle, something caught her eye. Fresh marks on the inside of the door itself, carved into the U at eye level, a single letter, M. Her initial freshly cut into the oak, the edges still pale where the knife had bitten deep. Someone knew her name, had been in this building recently enough to carve it, and wanted her to know they were watching. Maggie locked the door behind her with hands that wanted to shake, but didn't. She walked back toward town through the cooling night, very aware of every shadow, every sound of movement in the darkness. The courthouse had secrets. She'd known that from the start. What she hadn't known was how many people were willing to kill to keep them buried. Maggie spent 2 days locked in her room, working by lamplight even when the sun blazed outside. She'd acquired a large sheet of blueprint paper from the town surveyor and was transferring every symbol she'd documented onto an accurate floor plan of the courthouse. The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical bath. Each symbol type appeared in specific locations. The circles marked exterior walls. The diamonds indicated structural support, but the triangles, those deep, deliberately carved triangles, marked something else entirely. When she connected them in the sequence shown on the original parchment, they formed a path from the front entrance, through the main hall into the courtroom, and stopping directly beneath where the judge's bench stood. The floor beneath the bench, Maggie studied her completed map, tracing the line of triangles with one finger. The symbols led down, not metaphorically, literally down, into the space the parchment had shown as basement rooms that supposedly didn't exist. She rolled up the blueprint carefully and tucked it into her leather satchel along with her tools. It was noon when she returned to the courthouse, the sun high and hot enough to drive most people indoors. The street was empty except for a stray dog sleeping in the shade of the general store. Inside the courthouse, dust motes floated in columns of light that fell through gaps in the boarded windows. Maggie lit her lanterns anyway. Where she was going, natural light wouldn't reach. The courtroom felt smaller in daylight, less ominous but somehow more expectant, as if the building knew what she'd come to find. She approached the judge's bench and set down her satchel. The wooden platform was solid, built to last. But according to her map, something lay directly beneath it. Maggie knelt and examined the floorboards. Most were original to the building, wide planks of pine worn smooth by decades of foot traffic. But near the back wall where the bench met the floor, 3 boards looked different. Newer, wood, though still aged, replaced sometime after the original construction. She ran her fingers along the edges of these boards, searching for purchase. They fit snugly, but when she worked the blade of her utility knife into the gap, one board lifted slightly. Maggie wedged the knife deeper and pried up. The board came free with a groan of protesting nails, revealing darkness beneath and the smell of cool, dry air rising from below. She removed the other 2 boards more easily. They'd been designed to lift away, she realized, a hidden access point, disguised as ordinary flooring. Beneath the boards lay a brass plate, green with age but still intact. Engraved into its surface were initials in an elaborate script, CS, and below them a heavy iron ring. Maggie grasped the ring with both hands and pulled. The plate lifted smoothly, revealing a shaft descending into darkness. Metal rungs had been set into the stone wall, forming a ladder. She couldn't see the bottom, but cool air flowed upward, carrying the scent of earth and stone, and something else, something that smelled like preserved wood and old paper. She secured one lantern to her belt and began to climb down. The descent felt longer than it should have been. 10 rungs, 20. The light from above grew distant and dim. When her boot finally touched solid ground, Maggie estimated she'd climbed down at least 15 feet. She unhooked the lantern and raised it high. The chamber stretched before her, larger than she'd expected. The walls were carved directly from bedrock, the ceiling supported by timber beams that looked as solid as the day they'd been installed. The floor was smooth stone, worn in places by foot traffic. And against the far wall, exactly as they'd appeared in her dreams since finding the Corwin file, stood 6 wooden crates. Maggie moved closer, her lantern casting jumping shadows. Each crate was roughly 3 feet square, bound with iron straps and secured with heavy padlocks. The wood was weathered, but intact, and carved into each lid was a symbol from the sequence she'd been following. 5 crates bore the familiar circles, diamonds and triangles. The 6th bore something different, a letter carved deep and fresh into the aged wood. Met, her initial, just like the one on the courthouse door. Someone had been down here, recently, and they'd marked this specific crate for her to find. Maggie's hands trembled as she set down her lantern. The padlock on the marked crate was old and rusted, but unlike the others, it hung loose in its hasp, already opened. She lifted the lid. Inside the crate, wrapped in oil-stained canvas, were bundles of paper currency, aged bills in denominations Maggie hadn't seen outside of museums. Beneath them, wrapped separately, were gold bars, small ones, each stamped with markings she couldn't read in the dim light but could feel under her fingertips. Cold, heavy, unmistakably real. She sat back on her heels, staring at the fortune before her. $14 million. The file had said. If this was just one crate, then the total value of what sat in this underground chamber was incomprehensible. But it was what lay beneath the gold that made her blood run cold. A leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed but perfectly preserved in the dry air of the vault. Maggie lifted it carefully and opened to the first page. Handwritten entries in precise script, dated from 1930 to 1933. Names, dates, dollar amounts. And next to each entry, a description of services rendered. Mayor William Hartwell, $2,000, zoning permit approval. Judge Theodore Aston, $5,000, dismissal of charges. Sheriff Henry Reeves, $1,500, evidence suppression. The list went on for pages. Businessmen, politicians, law enforcement, an entire network of corruption, documented in meticulous detail by the very criminals who'd bribed them. Maggie's finger stopped on one entry near the middle of the ledger. Sheriff H. Reeves, $3,000. Witness intimidation, December 1932. H. Reeves. Harlan's grandfather. The man who'd served as sheriff when this courthouse was still operating. The man Harlan had mentioned with careful pride when they'd first met. A corrupt lawman, bought and paid for by the Corwin syndicate. She turned more pages, finding more names she recognized from town history. Founding families, respected citizens, all of them complicit in a criminal enterprise that had operated for years under the protection of those sworn to stop it. At the back of the ledger, tucked into a pocket sewn into the leather binding, was a letter. The paper was thick, expensive, the handwriting elegant. To whoever finds this record, know that justice in this town died long before the Corwin syndicate fell. We merely exposed what was already rotten. The men whose names fill these pages built their fortunes on lies and called it civilization. This treasure is yours now. Use it wisely or use it foolishly. Either way, the truth is here for those brave enough to look. H.R. per January 1933. H.R. Henry Reeves. Harlan's grandfather. Maggie closed the ledger and pressed it against her chest. This wasn't just stolen money. This was evidence of systematic corruption at every level of frontier society. The courthouse hadn't been a symbol of justice. It had been a theater where criminals and lawmen performed a play called Law and Order, while backstage they divided the spoils. A sound echoed from above, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps on the courthouse floor. Maggie extinguished her lantern and stood in complete darkness, her heart hammering. She'd locked the door, she was certain of it. But someone was up there, moving through the building with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. She felt for the ladder in the dark, the ledger still clutched in her other hand. She couldn't leave it here. Whatever happened next, this record had to survive. The footsteps grew louder. Closer to the courtroom, Maggie made a decision. She tucked the ledger into her satchel, moved silently to the far corner of the chamber, and waited. Light appeared at the top of the shaft. Then a voice, cultured and amused. "Miss Calloway, I know you're down there. I can see your lantern at the bottom." Maggie stayed silent, pressed against the cold stone wall. "My name is Thomas Vale. I'm not here to harm you. Quite the opposite." A pause. "I'm coming down. Please don't shoot me. I'm not armed, and I bruise easily." The ladder creaked as weight settled on it. Maggie watched a pair of expensive leather shoes descend rung by rung, followed by pressed trousers and a suit jacket that probably cost more than most people in town earned in a month. Thomas Vale reached the bottom and turned, holding a kerosene lantern in one hand. He was perhaps 40, with silver threading through dark hair and the kind of easy smile that came from never having to work very hard for anything. "There you are," he said pleasantly. "I was beginning to think I'd have to come back with a search party." "How did you get in?" Maggie's voice was steady, despite her racing pulse. "Through the door, same as you." He gestured upward with the lantern. "I'm an antiques dealer, Miss Calloway. Old locks are something of a specialty. This is private property. Technically, yes, but I think we both know you're not down here to study architectural history." His eyes moved to the open crate, the gleam of gold visible even in the lantern light. Word travels fast in certain circles. Maggie stepped aside to let him enter. He looked around her small room, the desk covered in notes and photographs, the blueprint tacked to the wall, and sighed deeply. "You found it," he said. "Not a question. The vault." "Yes." "And the ledger?" Maggie moved to her desk and lifted the leather-bound book from where she'd hidden it beneath her other papers. "Your grandfather took bribes from the Corwin syndicate, multiple payments over several years." Harlan's jaw tightened, but he didn't look surprised. "I know. My father knew too. It's why he spent his whole life trying to prove Henry Reeves wasn't the man those records said he was." He met her eyes. "It's why he died in that courthouse, looking for evidence that would clear the family name." "What happened to him?" "The structure wasn't safe. Part of the second floor collapsed while he was searching." Harlan's voice was flat, emotionless. The tone of a man who'd repeated this story too many times. "They found him 3 days later. He'd been going through old files, trying to find something that would contradict what everyone said about his father." "Did he find anything?" "No." Harlan moved to the window and stared out at the dark street. "Because there was nothing to find. My grandfather was corrupt. He took money from criminals. He helped them operate freely in this town, and when the syndicate fell, he helped them hide their fortune before disappearing himself. Disappearing, left town in January 1933. Never came back. Never sent word. Just vanished like he'd never existed." Harlan turned back to her. "The pocket watch you took from the vault. Thomas Vale gave it to you, didn't he?" Maggie's hand moved instinctively to her pocket. "How do you know about Thomas Vale?" "Because he gave me one too. 10 years ago, when I first made sheriff." Harlan pulled his own watch from his vest, identical to the one she carried. Said it was a gift, a token of respect for a lawman trying to do better than his ancestors. "It's not just a watch, is it?" "No." Harlan set it on her desk with a metallic click. "There's a tracking mechanism inside, German engineering. Expensive and subtle. Vale uses them to keep track of people he finds interesting." Maggie pulled out her own watch and placed it beside Harlan's. "Why would he want to track us?" "Because we're both looking for the same thing. The truth about what happened to the syndicate's money. And Vale's that whoever finds it first has leverage." Harlan's expression hardened. "He's not an antiques dealer, Miss Calloway. He's a fence. Has been for 30 years. If you found that vault, he'll want to know exactly what's in it. He already knows. He was there. Then he knows about the ledger, which means he knows you have evidence that could destroy half the families in this county." Harlan moved closer. "You can't publish that information. It would tear this town apart." The truth is the truth, Sheriff. The truth is that people who weren't even born when those crimes happened will suffer for them. My family, others, good people who've spent their lives trying to make up for what their grandparents did. He picked up the ledger, his hands gentle despite the anger in his eyes. Is that justice, or just cruelty dressed up as history? Maggie took the ledger back. What would you have me do? Pretend I never found it? Let the lie continue. I'd have you think carefully about who gets hurt when you shine light into dark places. Harlan pulled a small key from his pocket and set it on her desk. This opens my father's safety deposit box at the bank. Inside are his notes from when he was searching the courthouse. Maybe they'll help you understand why some secrets are better left buried. He moved toward the door, then paused. Thomas Vale isn't the only one following you. There are others, men who don't care about history or truth. They just want the money. Watch your back, Miss Calloway. After he left, Maggie sat in silence, the ledger in one hand and the key in the other. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, men with tracking watches knew exactly where she was and what she'd found. The treasure wasn't gold anymore. It was truth. And truth, she was learning, was far more dangerous than any stolen fortune could ever be. Maggie took the morning train to Santa Fe, the ledger wrapped in oilcloth and tucked deep in her traveling bag. She'd told no one she was leaving, though she suspected the tracking watch in her discarded coat pocket would tell Thomas Vale exactly where she'd been. Evelyn Moore lived in a small adobe house on the edge of the city, surrounded by sage and twisted juniper trees. She was waiting on the porch when Maggie arrived, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. "You look like someone carrying a dead body," Evelyn said by way of greeting. "Come inside before you collapse." The interior was cluttered with books and newspapers, filing cabinets stuffed with clippings, walls covered with maps and photographs connected by red string. The workspace of someone who'd never stopped investigating, even after the world told her to quit. Maggie set the ledger on Evelyn's kitchen table. "I found what the symbols were hiding." Evelyn unwrapped the oilcloth slowly, her weathered hands steady. She opened the ledger and began to read, her expression unchanging, as she turned page after page. When she reached the letter at the back, signed by Henry Reeves, she closed the book and looked at Maggie for a long moment. "Do you know what you have here?" Evelyn's voice was quiet. "Danger. I'm saying that powerful people protect their legacies. The grandchildren of the men named in that ledger are judges now, senators, business owners. They have resources and motivation to keep the past buried." Evelyn sat down heavily. "When I published my story about the Chicago Syndicate in 1934, I lost everything, my career, my reputation. Someone sent me Marcus's obituary as a warning, so I stopped writing. Moved here, became a ghost. But you survived, by surrendering." Evelyn's voice cracked. "I chose survival over truth, and I've regretted it every single day since." Maggie looked at the ledger, then back at the woman who'd once been brave enough to chase stories that mattered. "What would you do? If you were me?" "I'd run, change my name, burn that ledger and never speak of it again." Evelyn's eyes were wet. "That's what I'd do to save your life. And if I wanted to save my soul instead." Evelyn smiled sadly. "Then you'd do what I could. You'd publish every word, cite every source, and you'd do it loud enough that silencing you would prove everything you'd written." She reached across the table and gripped Maggie's hand. "But you'd better be ready to lose everything, because truth has a price, and the cost is always higher than you think." They spent the afternoon photographing every page of the ledger. Evelyn had connections, editors who'd published controversial stories, lawyers who specialized in protecting whistleblowers, even a few old colleagues who still believed journalism mattered. "We'll send copies to 3 different newspapers," Evelyn explained, organizing the photographs. "One in California, one in New York, one in Chicago. We'll include context, historical documentation, everything needed to verify authenticity. If something happens to you, the story still breaks." Maggie watched her mentor work with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. "Why are you helping me? if it's this dangerous. Because I'm old and tired of living like a coward. Evelyn sealed the first envelope. Because maybe if I help you do what I couldn't, I'll sleep better at night. Because she stopped, her hands still. Because some truths are worth dying for, even if I was too afraid to die for them myself. A knock at the door made them both freeze. Evelyn moved to the window and peered through the curtain. Western Union. The telegram was addressed to Maggie. Only 3 people knew she was here. Evelyn, Sheriff Reeves, and whoever was tracking that silver watch. Evelyn opened it and read aloud. Don't come back to town. Situation escalated. Not safe. HR. Harlan Reeves, warning her away from the very place she needed to be. The vault, Maggie said. Someone's going after it. Let them have it. The gold doesn't matter. We have the evidence, but the original ledger is the only proof. Photographs can be disputed, dismissed as forgeries. Maggie grabbed her bag. I have to go back. That's what they want. They'll be waiting for you. Then I'd better not keep them waiting. Maggie headed for the door, then paused. Mail those envelopes tomorrow morning, no matter what. If anything happens to me, the story still needs to come out. Evelyn's expression was anguished. Margaret, promise me. I promise. Evelyn pulled her into a fierce embrace. Be smart. Be careful. And remember that living to fight another day isn't cowardice. It's strategy. Maggie caught the evening train back, watching the desert roll past in the fading light. She thought about Marcus Chen and Gerald Morrison and Sarah Donnelly, people who'd chased the truth and paid with their lives. She thought about her husband, dead in a war fought for principles he'd believed in. Would he have wanted her to risk everything for history, or would he have begged her to run, to choose survival over martyrdom? But Maggie knew the answer. He'd married a woman who couldn't leave injustice alone, who believed that truth mattered more than comfort. He would have told her to be careful, to be smart, and then he would have told her to do the right thing. Maggie arrived back in town after midnight. The streets were empty, the courthouse a dark silhouette against the starlit sky. But light flickered in its windows, not the steady glow of lanterns. Something orange and dancing. Fire. She ran. The front door hung open, torn from its hinges. Inside, papers littered the floor. The records room had been ransacked again, filing cabinets overturned, documents scattered like leaves, and from below, from the vault beneath the courtroom, came the sound of metal striking stone. Maggie descended the hidden shaft quickly, her boots finding rungs by memory rather than sight. The chamber below was chaos. 3 of the 6 crates had been broken open, their contents strewn across the floor. Gold bars, money, papers, and standing amid the wreckage, a crowbar in his hands, was Thomas Vale. Miss Calloway. He didn't sound surprised, didn't sound anything at all. I wondered if you'd come back. This is theft. This is liberation. He gestured at the gold. Another figure descended the ladder. A woman in deputy's uniform, young and determined, with her own gun drawn and aimed at Thomas Vale. Drop the crowbar, Deputy Nora Hughes said. Her voice was steady. Now, Vale looked at her, then at Reeves, then at Maggie. Whatever calculation he made, it didn't end in surrender. He lunged for Maggie, instead. Reeves fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space, echoing off stone walls. But Vale was already moving, using Maggie as a shield as he dragged her toward the far wall. Let her go, Nora shouted, training her gun on Vale's head. I don't think so. Vale's arm was an iron band across Maggie's chest. I'm walking out of here with the gold and the ledger. Anyone who tries to stop me, she dies first. You won't make it 10 feet. Reeves had repositioned, his gun never wavering. You're not that fast and we're not that forgiving. Try me. What happened next occurred in fragments, moments too fast to process individually. Vale shoved Maggie away, hard, sending her sprawling into one of the intact crates. Nora fired. The bullet caught Vale in the shoulder, spinning him around. Reeves fired. This shot hit center mass, and Vale collapsed against the wall. But in falling, he knocked over one of the kerosene lanterns. Oil spilled across the wooden crates, across the scattered papers, across centuries-old timber, dry as kindling. Fire erupted. It spread faster than thought, racing along the spilled oil, climbing the crates, reaching for the wooden support beams overhead. Smoke filled the chamber, thick and choking. Out! Reeves grabbed Maggie's arm, hauling her to her feet. Now, Nora tried to reach Vale, but the flames were already too fierce. The man slumped against the wall, blood spreading across his expensive suit, watching the fire consume everything he'd wanted to steal. Maggie grabbed the ledger from where she'd hidden it beneath her coat. The original, the only proof that mattered. They ran for the ladder. But first, alone in the ruins with the morning sun warming the stones, she thought about the ledger. The pages that had survived fire and fear and decades of intentional forgetting. She thought about all the people throughout history who'd hidden evidence, who'd chosen comfort over truth, who'd let injustice persist because confronting it was too dangerous, too costly, too hard. And she thought about the others, the ones who'd risked everything, who'd published the story anyway, who'd chosen integrity over survival and truth over silence. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill. Soon people would gather for the ceremony. Reporters, historians, descendants of the men named in the ledger, some angry, some ashamed, all finally forced to reckon with a past they'd been allowed to ignore. Maggie pulled out her notebook and began to write the speech she'd deliver. Not about treasure or adventure or the romance of discovery. About responsibility. About the weight of truth. About the cost of looking away when looking directly would require you to act. History doesn't always hide in the dark, she wrote. Sometimes it's right there, carved into the walls we've stopped looking at. And the question isn't whether we'll find it. The question is what we'll do when we do. Behind her, workers began clearing rubble, preparing to build something new on the foundation of something old and broken, and finally honestly examine. Maggie closed her notebook and looked at the ruins one last time. 40 cents, she thought. That's all it cost to buy this building. But the truth it contained had demanded everything, and she would do it again, without hesitation, without regret, because some things, justice, integrity, the courage to speak truth regardless of consequence, were worth any price. Even 40 cents for a broken courthouse and a $14 million stash that criminals left behind. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.